Chapter 1. The Silent Sky. Elias Vance stared at the wall of monitors in the Pacific Northwest Dispatch Center. The screens glowed with the green and red arteries of Seattle rush hour traffic. It was 5:15 on a Tuesday afternoon. The logistics hub smelled of stale coffee and burnt ozone from overworked computer servers. Elias took a sip from his cold ceramic mug. His eyes tracked a convoy of heavy refrigerated trucks inching along Interstate 5. They were hauling 60 tons of perishable food toward the city center. He tapped his pen against the wooden desk. Efficiency was his religion. Delays cost money, delays cost food. Rain lashed against the reinforced glass of the fifth-floor office window. The gray storm clouds hung low over the dark water of the Puget Sound. Beside him sat Marcus. Marcus was a junior dispatcher who spent more time looking at his mobile phone than the freight trackers. Elias did not care as long as the transport trucks met their strict delivery windows. "We have a jam on the viaduct," Marcus said. He leaned back in his leather chair. "Looks like a minor accident. It is backing up traffic for 3 miles. Reroute Team Alpha through the Southern Industrial District," Elias said. His voice was flat and calm. He did not look away from the main digital screen. "Tell them to take the surface streets. The meat in those trailers will spoil if they sit idle for another hour." Marcus nodded. He reached for his plastic headset. Then the world stopped. It did not happen with a bang. It happened with a sharp, physical click. A singular sound that echoed sharply through the large operations room. The low hum of the central air conditioning died instantly. The long fluorescent lights above flickered once and snapped to absolute black. The giant wall of traffic monitors went dark. The constant, heavy vibration of the server racks in the adjacent secure room ceased entirely. Silence crashed into the office. It was heavy. It was sudden. "Power outage," Marcus said in the dark. His voice sounded thin without the background noise of the cooling fans and machines. "Get the backup diesel generators online," Elias said. He stood up from his desk. He felt a strange, heavy pressure deep in his ears. It felt exactly like the cabin pressure dropping rapidly in a commercial airplane. The air suddenly tasted metallic and dry. He walked quickly to the tall glass window. The red emergency lights in the office ceiling should have engaged immediately. The heavy battery backups for the vital computer systems should have started beeping. They did not. The silence was complete and absolute. Elias pressed his hand against the cold glass. He looked down at the wet streets of Seattle. The traffic lights at the intersections were dead. The street lamps, which had just turned on to fight the winter gloom, were completely out. That was normal for a citywide blackout. What was not normal was the road itself. On Interstate 5, thousands of vehicles were coasting. Headlights and red taillights had vanished simultaneously. The glowing, moving river of evening traffic was plunged into total darkness. Then the brutal physics of momentum took over. A heavy semi-truck veered blindly into the concrete center divider. Without electronic power steering or anti-lock brakes, the massive vehicle folded like a pocket knife. The long cargo trailer swung out violently, blocking 3 lanes of highway. Cars slammed directly into the steel box. Without the roaring sound of internal combustion engines, the noises of the collisions were horrifyingly clear. Metal tore loudly. Safety glass shattered into thousands of pieces. Heavy steel crumpled against steel. The organic cacophony of the massive pileup drifted up to the 5th-floor window. It was an immediate chain reaction. Dozens of vehicles smashed blindly into each other in the gloom. Elias watched a small sedan get completely crushed beneath the heavy wheels of a commercial delivery van. Nobody was honking. Car horns require electricity to function. There was only the brutal sound of physical destruction. "Elias," Marcus said. His voice shook with panic. "My phone is dead. It will not even turn on. It had an 80% battery charge just a minute ago." Elias reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out his own device. The glass screen was black. He held down the power button. Nothing happened. He looked back out the window. The entire city skyline was dark. No tall office buildings glowed. No neon signs flashed on the storefronts. The Space Needle was merely a dark shadow against the darker storm clouds. This was not a blown transformer. A cold knot formed tight in his stomach. The supply chain logistics manager inside his brain began to calculate the grim math. He understood the fragile nature of modern civilization better than anyone in the building. Cities possessed exactly 3 days of food on the grocery shelves. Municipal water pumps ran on high-voltage electricity. Hospitals possessed backup generators, but modern generators required sensitive microchips to regulate power flow. If the microchips were dead, everything was dead. Marcus, Elias said quietly, grab your winter coat. Do you have comfortable walking shoes? What is going on? Why aren't the city emergency sirens going off? Elias did not answer. He was staring at the sky over the Puget Sound. The low clouds parted slightly. A massive, terrifying shape descended blindly through the gray mist. It was a commercial airliner. A Boeing 737. It was on a standard approach path to Seattle-Tacoma Airport. But the massive flying machine was completely dark. No red or green navigation lights blinked on its long wings. No bright landing lights pierced the gloom. More terrifying was the absolute silence. The massive dual-jet engines were dead. The plane was gliding. It was a massive metal brick falling out of the sky. The pilot was desperately trying to pull the nose up to gain altitude. Elias could see the angle of the giant wings shifting as the pilot wrestled with the manual controls. But without fly-by-wire computer systems to assist the heavy hydraulics, the flaps were likely frozen stiff. The aircraft banked sharply and violently to the left. It lost altitude far too fast. The sheer mass of the plane was pulling it down. "Oh my God," Marcus whispered in the dark room. He had walked up to the window. His rapid breath fogged the cold glass. Elias could not look away. He watched the massive plane drop toward the dark, freezing waters of the bay. He could see the silhouettes of the helpless passengers in the tiny oval windows. They were plunging toward the earth in complete silence. The nose of the plane hit the surface of the water first. There was no fireball. There was no explosion. Jet fuel requires an electrical spark or extreme heat to ignite. The electrical systems were entirely dead. Instead, the plane simply shattered under the immense physical force of the impact. The sudden deceleration sheared the massive wings off instantly. The long metal fuselage broke apart like a hollow, fragile toy. A massive, towering plume of white water and torn metal erupted high into the air. The sound of the destruction hit the office window a second later. It was not a boom. It was a deep, resonant, agonizing crunch of tearing aluminum, snapping steel frames, and displaced water. The heavy tail section of the plane sank almost immediately into the dark depths. Debris scattered across the choppy, gray surface of the Sound. Then, the awful silence returned. The freezing water swallowed the wreckage whole. Elias backed away from the window. The cold knot in his stomach turned to pure ice. He knew exactly what had just happened. He had read the dry, classified government white papers regarding infrastructure vulnerabilities. He had attended the federal emergency management seminars on supply chain collapse. An electromagnetic pulse, a high-altitude nuclear detonation, or a coordinated weaponized atmospheric strike. It did not matter who pulled the trigger. The final result was exactly the same. The grid was gone. Not just the power grid. The entire technological foundation of the modern world had been wiped out in a single fraction of a second. The city of Seattle, with its millions of trapped people, was now a concrete cage. Within 24 hours, the clean water would stop flowing from the taps. Within 48 hours, the grocery store shelves would be stripped bare. In 72 hours, the mass violence would begin. "Elias, we need to call someone," Marcus panicked. He was hitting his dead phone repeatedly against his open palm. "We need to call 911. "There is no 911, Elias said. His voice was steady. Panic was a waste of vital calories. Panic led to poor decisions. He walked to his wooden desk. He opened the bottom drawer. It was locked. He reached under the desk, pulled a hidden brass key taped to the wood, and unlocked the heavy drawer. He pulled out a large, heavy canvas backpack, his survival bag. It was packed with obsessive precision. Elias had spent years refining its contents. 5 days of vacuum-sealed military rations. 2 heavy plastic canteens with integrated charcoal water filters. A comprehensive first aid kit packed with combat trauma dressings, tourniquets, and broad-spectrum antibiotics. A fixed-blade carbon steel survival knife. 50 feet of high-tensile strength parachute cord. 3 separate ways to make a fire. 2 reflective thermal blankets to retain body heat. And at the extremely bottom, wrapped securely in an oiled cleaning cloth, was a compact 9mm semi-automatic pistol. Beside it lay 4 spare metal magazines, each fully loaded with heavy-grain hollow-point ammunition. He did not pull the weapon out. He simply ran his hand over the bundle to confirm its solid weight was there. He would need it soon enough. He hoisted the heavy canvas bag onto his shoulder. "What is that?" Marcus asked. He was staring at Elias like he was looking at a total stranger. "Where are you going?" "I am leaving the city," Elias said. He walked past Marcus toward the stairwell doors. The elevators are dead traps. We are on the 5th floor. Take the stairs. Go home, Marcus. Fill every bathtub and sink in your apartment with water right now before the pipe pressure drops. Lock your doors. Do not let anyone inside. You are crazy. The power will be back in an hour. Elias stopped at the heavy fire door. He looked back at the young man. The power is never coming back. Get moving. Elias pushed the heavy metal door open and stepped into the pitch-black stairwell. He reached into the side pocket of his backpack and pulled out a heavy-duty light-emitting diode flashlight. He clicked the rubber button. Nothing happened. He unscrewed the bottom and checked the batteries. They were fresh. He clicked it again. Dead. The electromagnetic pulse had fried the small circuit board inside the flashlight. He cursed under his breath. He reached into the bag again and pulled out a yellow plastic emergency glow stick. He cracked the internal vial. A sickly green chemical light spilled into the dark stairwell. It cast long, dancing shadows against the bare concrete walls. Elias began his descent, 5 flights of stairs. The building was beginning to wake up to the nightmare. He could hear voices echoing from the floors above and below. People were yelling in the dark. Heavy fire doors were slamming shut. Someone was crying loudly on the 3rd floor landing. He tuned the noise out. Emotion was a severe liability. He had only one priority now. Harper. His daughter was 40 miles away. She was leading a wilderness survival expedition somewhere on the lower ridges of the Cascade Mountains. Harper knew how to build a fire from damp wood. She knew how to forage. But she would have no idea what had just happened to the rest of the world. Her electronic global positioning system device would be a dead piece of plastic. Her emergency radio would be silent. She would eventually hike down out of those woods expecting to find a hot meal and a warm bed. Instead, she would walk right into a slaughterhouse. Elias reached the ground floor lobby. The electronic security turnstiles were frozen solid. A crowd of 40 or 50 confused office workers was milling around the marble floor. They were clustered near the main glass exit doors, looking out at the dark street. The air in the lobby was thick with the smell of wet wool coats and rising fear. The doors are stuck, a security guard said loudly. The guard looked pale. He was tugging fruitlessly at the thick brass handles. The electronic magnetic locks had failed in the closed position to prevent looting during a power failure. Elias pushed his way through the crowd. He did not say excuse me. He used his shoulder to part the terrified group. He walked over to a heavy metal trash can sitting near the reception desk. He picked it up. It was heavy. Stand back, Elias commanded. He turned, braced his legs, and swung the heavy metal cylinder directly at the center of the reinforced glass door. The impact sounded like a gunshot. The glass spider-webbed but held. Elias swung again. Harder this time. He put his back and shoulders into the violent motion. The glass shattered outward. Thousands of cubes of tempered safety glass rained down onto the wet concrete of the sidewalk. The freezing cold wind howled through the breach instantly. Elias dropped the trash can. He stepped through the broken metal frame. He was standing on 4th Avenue. The freezing rain hit his face. The sharp smell of raw gasoline and burning rubber hit his nose. The street was a graveyard of twisted metal. Cars were slammed into each other at odd angles. Steam hissed from ruptured radiators. A city bus had jumped the curb and crashed into the brick facade of a bank. The passengers were climbing out of the shattered emergency windows. Some were bleeding. All of them were shouting into the rain. Elias looked east. He looked toward the invisible mountains hidden behind the dark storm clouds. 40 miles. He had to cross 40 miles of a dying city. He had no vehicle. He had no communication. He had to navigate streets that were quickly filling with desperate, terrified people. He adjusted the heavy straps of his canvas backpack. He pulled his collar up against the biting wind. He took his first step over the broken glass and into the dark age. A loud, metallic screech tore through the air from the intersection ahead. It was followed by a chorus of panicked screams. The crowd of stranded commuters near the crashed bus scattered into the alleys. A man came running rapidly around the corner of the brick bank. He was missing his shoes. His white dress shirt was completely soaked in dark crimson blood. He had a long hunting knife clutched tightly in his right hand. His eyes were wide and wild with absolute terror. He was not running away from the crashed cars. He was sprinting directly toward Elias. Chapter 2. The Gridlock. The bloody man with the wild eyes was sprinting directly toward Elias. He did not slow down. He did not look left or right. He was completely consumed by blind panic. The man slipped on the wet concrete. His bare feet slid through a puddle of dark motor oil. He crashed hard into the side of a stalled yellow taxicab. His shoulder shattered the side mirror. The man did not seem to feel the pain. He bounced off the yellow metal and kept running blindly down the center of the avenue. He was screaming a single name over and over into the freezing rain. Elias did not stop. He did not look back to see where the bleeding man was going. Empathy was a luxury of the civilized world. That world had ended 20 minutes ago. Elias forced his legs to keep a steady, punishing pace. He gripped the thick canvas straps of his survival bag. He needed to get out of the dense downtown core. The tall glass and steel skyscrapers were already turning into concrete tombs. Without electricity to pump fresh water up to the water towers on the roofs, the plumbing would fail before midnight. Without forced air heating, the high floors would become freezing cages by morning. He walked south. He stayed close to the brick walls of the older buildings. He avoided the center of the sidewalks. He used the same spatial awareness he used when inspecting a busy warehouse floor. He kept his head down. He kept his eyes moving. The chaos on the streets was accelerating. It was no longer just confusion. It was turning into active desperation. People were sitting inside their dead cars. They were frantically turning their ignition keys. They were waiting for their dashboard radios to crackle back to life. They were waiting for the police sirens. They did not understand the permanence of the dark sky. They still believed this was a temporary inconvenience. Elias knew the truth. The silence of the jet engines falling into the bay had confirmed it. The microchips were baked solid. The power grid was completely destroyed. He passed a large corner grocery store. The heavy glass front doors were completely shattered. The security gates had failed to drop because the backup batteries were dead. A violent crowd of 40 or 50 people was crammed inside the small aisles. Elias heard the sharp, terrifying sound of glass bottles smashing against the tile floor. He heard angry shouting. He heard a woman scream in pain. A man in a torn business suit ran out of the broken doorway. He was clutching 2 plastic-gallon jugs of distilled water to his chest. Another man tackled him from behind. They both crashed hard onto the wet sidewalk. The plastic jugs burst open. The precious clean water washed away into the dirty street gutter. The 2 men began to punch each other ruthlessly in the face over the empty plastic containers. Elias felt a cold chill run down his spine. It had only been an hour. They were already fighting like feral animals over basic water. The logistics manager inside his brain calculated the grim math of the city. 2 million people, 3 days of food on the shelves, 0 incoming transport trucks. The city was a massive, ticking bomb of starvation. He had his heavy canvas bag. He had 5 days of military rations and a water filter. He did not need to fight for scraps today. He just needed to leave. He analyzed the mental map of Seattle in his head. The main avenues were absolute choke points. They were clogged with dead vehicles and panicking crowds. He needed the service alleys. He needed the hidden industrial loading zones. Elias turned left into a narrow alleyway behind a row of dead restaurants. The smell of rotting garbage and spilled fryer oil was thick in the cold air. He climbed over a rusted chain-link fence. He dropped down into an empty delivery bay. He needed a massive increase in speed. Walking 40 miles to the Cascade Mountains would take him 2 full days. 2 days exposed to the freezing rain, 2 days exposed to desperate people. He needed wheels. A vehicle with an internal combustion engine was useless if it relied on an electronic fuel pump or a computer module. He needed pure, simple mechanics. Behind a crashed postal delivery truck, he saw his salvation. It was a heavy-duty courier bicycle. It was lying on its side next to a dented aluminum light pole. The rider was nowhere to be seen. A dark smear of blood stained the concrete near the rear tire. The courier had likely been hit by the postal truck when the traffic lights instantly died. Elias walked over to the bicycle. He picked it up by the handlebars. It was a sturdy mountain bike frame. It had thick, deep-treaded tires designed for rough city pavement. He checked the rubber. The tire pressure was perfectly firm. He spun the pedals backward. The steel chain clicked smoothly over the gears. The heavy metal lock was secured to a bracket on the frame, but it was not locked to the wheel. This was a massive tactical advantage. A bicycle turned human energy into highly efficient forward momentum. He could increase his travel speed from 3 miles per hour to 12 miles per hour. He could bypass the gridlocked highways entirely. He could ride on the dirt shoulders and the pedestrian paths. Elias swung his leg over the wet leather seat. He adjusted his heavy canvas backpack so it sat high on his shoulders. He pushed down on the right pedal. The bicycle surged forward. The physical exertion instantly warmed his cold muscles. The freezing wind bit at his face, but he ignored the discomfort. He was moving. He was finally closing the distance between himself and his daughter. He pedaled hard for 3 miles through the southern warehouse district. The streets here were wider and darker. The towering concrete storage facilities cast long, deep shadows. He heard the distant sounds of breaking glass and shouting echoing off the flat walls, but he saw very few people. He approached a long underpass beneath a major railway line. The tunnel was completely dark. The concrete walls dripped with dirty rainwater. The ground was littered with broken wooden pallets and wet trash. Elias slowed his pedaling. He squeezed the handbrakes gently. The rubber brake pads squeaked against the metal rims. He did not want to ride blindly into the total darkness. He clicked his dead flashlight purely out of habit. It remained completely dark. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the yellow chemical glow stick. He held it in his left hand while steering with his right. The sickly green light cast a narrow circle of visibility on the wet asphalt. He rode halfway through the long tunnel. The air was stagnant and smelled of old urine. Suddenly, shadows detached themselves from the concrete pillars. 4 young men stepped directly into the center of the tunnel. They blocked his path entirely. They wore heavy hooded sweatshirts pulled up over their heads. Elias squeezed the brakes hard. The rear tire skidded slightly on the wet ground. He stopped 10 feet away from the group. He looked at their hands. They were not holding guns. They were holding pieces of scavenged metal. One had a thick wooden baseball bat. The tallest one in the center held a heavy, rusted steel plumbing pipe. They looked scared. They looked completely soaked and freezing, but their eyes were wide with dangerous adrenaline. They were young, strong, and desperate. "Get off the bike," the tall one said. His voice echoed loudly in the concrete tunnel. He slapped the heavy steel pipe against his open palm. The sharp metal sound was a clear threat. "Leave the heavy bag, too. Just walk away." Elias kept his feet planted flat on the wet ground. He kept the thick metal frame of the bicycle tightly between his legs. It was a barrier. "You do not want to do this," Elias said. His voice was completely flat. It showed absolutely no emotion. "Let me pass through the tunnel." The tall kid laughed nervously. He looked at his 3 friends. They began to fan out slowly. They were trying to surround him. They were a pack of wolves testing a lone animal. They did not see a dangerous threat. They saw a tired, middle-aged man in a wet jacket holding a glow stick. "I said, get off the damn bike, old man," the tall kid yelled. He took 2 fast steps forward. He raised the heavy steel pipe above his shoulder. Elias knew the limits of negotiation. Words had lost their power the moment the electricity died. The social contract was officially broken. Violence was the only remaining currency. He did not argue. He did not shout a warning. He simply let the bicycle fall to the pavement with a loud, clattering crash. The heavy canvas bag shifted on his back. His right hand reached quickly inside his wet jacket. He bypassed the zippers. His fingers found the cold, hard-textured grip of the compact 9mm pistol holstered at his waist. He gripped it tightly. He drew the weapon smoothly from the leather sheath. He raised it to chest height with both hands. He pressed his left thumb down on the metal safety lever. The sharp, metallic click echoed violently off the walls of the underpass. It was a universal sound. It was the sound of absolute finality. The tall kid froze completely. His heavy boots stopped moving. The rusted steel pipe hovered uselessly in the air. He stared in pure shock at the black steel muzzle pointing directly at the center of his chest. Elias felt his own heart pounding heavily against his ribs. His index finger rested perfectly flat against the outside of the steel trigger guard. He felt a terrifying wave of cold clarity wash over his mind. He was perfectly ready to pull the trigger. He was ready to kill a human being over a piece of aluminum transport. The realization was sickening. The cautious office manager who worried about late vegetable deliveries was dead. The survivor had taken total control. "Drop the pipe," Elias commanded. His voice was low and deadly quiet. The tall kid swallowed hard. His false bravado melted away instantly. The heavy steel pipe slipped from his fingers. It hit the concrete with a loud clang. He took a slow step backward. His 3 friends had already retreated deep into the dark shadows near the wall. They wanted absolutely no part of a gunfight. Elias did not lower the weapon. He kept the iron sights perfectly aligned with the tall kid. He used his left hand to reach down and grab the handlebars of the bicycle. He pulled the bike upright. He began to push it forward slowly. He walked directly past the young men in complete silence. He kept his eyes locked on their hands. He kept the pistol raised and ready. They did not move a single muscle until Elias was entirely past them. He reached the far end of the tunnel and stepped out into the freezing rain. He holstered the pistol, but left his hand resting firmly on the grip. He swung his leg over the bicycle. His hands were shaking slightly. The adrenaline crash was hitting his nervous system. He gripped the handlebars tight and pedaled hard. He rode for another mile toward the Southern Industrial Bridge. This massive steel structure was the only crossing over the deep river that separated the downtown core from the southern highways. It was his only path to the mountains. He turned the final corner onto the main approach avenue. He squeezed the handbrakes hard. The bicycle skidded to a sudden halt. Elias stared straight ahead. The cold rain lashed at his face. The massive bridge was completely blocked. It was not blocked by a random pileup of dead cars. It was blocked by a deliberate, perfectly engineered barricade. 5 heavy city transit buses were parked sideways, completely sealing off the entry lanes. Elias squinted through the gloom. The power had only been dead for 2 hours. There was absolutely no way the local city police had organized a major structural blockade this quickly without radio communications. He looked at the top of the yellow buses. Men were standing on the metal roofs. They were wearing matching heavy black tactical vests. They were not wearing police uniforms. They were holding modern military-style rifles. And they were pointing those black rifles directly down at the massive, screaming crowd of citizens trying to escape the city. The gridlock was not an accident. They were trapped. Chapter 3. The Edge of the Wild. Harper Vance wiped the freezing rainwater from her eyes. She stood on a narrow ledge of gray granite. The heavy canvas pack dug familiar, calloused grooves into her shoulders. Below her, the thick pine forests of the Cascade Mountains dropped sharply into a deep ravine. The air was incredibly thin and cold. It smelled of wet cedar and crushed ferns. She turned around to check her clients. There were 3 of them. They were wealthy tech workers from Seattle who had paid $2,000 each for a 3-day guided wilderness immersion. They wore expensive, brightly colored waterproof jackets that had never touched actual dirt until this weekend. They were currently miserable. "How much further until we reach the camp?" Todd asked. He was leaning heavily against a wet pine tree, his breath plumed in white clouds. He was exhausted. 2 miles, Harper said. Her voice was steady and even. She did not show fatigue. "We have an hour of daylight left. The terrain gets flat after this ridge. Drink some water. We keep moving." Harper reached into her chest pocket. She pulled out a thick plastic global positioning system device. The digital map glowed brightly against the darkening forest. They were exactly where they needed to be. She keyed the microphone on her shoulder-mounted radio. She intended to check in with the state park ranger station in the valley. She pressed the transmit button. The device popped loudly against her ear. It sounded like a small firecracker exploding inside the plastic casing. A sharp sting of static electricity bit her thumb. Harper dropped the radio. It hit the wet dirt. A thin wisp of acrid white smoke curled out from the speaker grill. Before she could process the broken radio, the pressure hit her. It was a violent, sudden shift in the atmosphere. Her ears popped painfully. The air tasted metallic, like the moment right before a massive lightning strike. Then the light died. The expensive headlamps worn by the 3 hikers blinked out simultaneously. The glowing screen of Harper's navigation device turned completely black. The digital watch on her left wrist went blank. The forest was instantly plunged into heavy, suffocating darkness. The sun had already dipped behind the high peaks, and the thick tree canopy blocked out the remaining twilight. "Hey," Todd yelled in the dark. "My light just died. Did you bring spare batteries?" "Do not move," Harper commanded. Her voice cut through the rising panic. "Nobody take a single step. The trail is narrow here." She closed her eyes for 3 seconds. She let her pupils adjust to the absolute lack of light. She reached down to her belt. She unclipped a backup tactical flashlight. She pressed the rubber tail switch. Nothing happened. She twisted the metal cap and checked the connection. She pressed it again. Dead. A cold sense of dread settled heavy in her stomach. Electronics did not fail all at once. 3 different headlamps, a radio, a satellite tracker, and a sealed tactical light. They operated on entirely different battery systems. There was only one physical phenomenon that caused a total, simultaneous failure of isolated electronic circuits. "Sarah, Mark," Harper called out. "Are you 2 standing still?" "We are here," Sarah said. Her voice was shaking. "It is so dark, I cannot see my own hands." "Stay exactly where you are," Harper said. She reached into the side pouch of her pack. She felt the smooth plastic of a chemical emergency light. She gripped it with both hands and bent the tube sharply in half. The internal glass vial shattered. A dull, yellow chemical glow began to spread. It was not bright, but it pushed back the total blackness just enough to see the edges of the trail. "Okay," Todd said. He sounded impatient and angry. "I am not standing out here in the freezing rain. Let us just get to the camp." Harper heard the sound of heavy boots scraping against loose rocks. "Todd, stop," Harper yelled. She swung the yellow glow stick toward the sound. Todd had stepped off the stable dirt path. He was trying to push past Sarah on the narrowest section of the granite ledge. His expensive hiking boot planted firmly onto a sheet of wet, moss-covered shale. The rock gave way instantly. Todd lost his balance. He let out a sharp cry of surprise. His arms flailed wildly in the dark air. He slipped backward over the steep edge of the trail. Gravity pulled him down the embankment. He tumbled violently through the sharp blackberry brambles and jagged rocks. The drop was not sheer, but it was incredibly steep. He rolled for 30 feet before slamming heavily against the thick trunk of a massive cedar tree. A sickening, wet crack echoed loudly up the ravine. It sounded exactly like a thick tree branch snapping in half. Then the screaming began. It was a primal, agonizing sound. It tore through the quiet forest. Todd was screaming completely out of his mind with pain. "Mark, hold Sarah right here," Harper ordered. She did not wait for an answer. She scrambled down the steep embankment. She dug her heels into the soft mud to control her slide. She held the yellow glow stick high. The thorny bushes tore at her waterproof pants. She reached the bottom of the ravine in 10 seconds. Todd was thrashing wildly on the wet ground. He was clutching his lower right leg. "Hold still," Harper said. She dropped to her knees beside him. She pinned his shoulders to the dirt with her body weight. "You are going to make it worse. Stop moving." Todd was hyperventilating. His eyes were wide and terrified in the yellow light. Harper moved the glow stick down to his leg. The injury was catastrophic. His right shin was bent at a completely unnatural, horrifying angle. The heavy bone had snapped cleanly in half. It was a severe compound fracture. The sharp, jagged edge of his tibia had pierced through the skin and the fabric of his expensive pants. Dark, thick blood was pouring out of the wound, mixing with the cold rainwater and mud. She had to stop the bleeding immediately. Harper reached to her thigh. She drew her heavy, fixed-blade carbon steel knife from its kydex sheath. She grabbed the torn fabric of Todd's pant leg and sliced downward. She exposed the bare, bloody skin of his calf. "Mark!" Harper yelled up the hill. "I need you down here right now, carefully." She heard Mark sliding clumsily down the embankment a moment later. He arrived, breathless and pale. He looked at the protruding bone and gagged. "Put your hands on his shoulders," Harper instructed. "Hold him down flat. He is going into physical shock. He is going to fight me when I do this." Mark nodded dumbly. He knelt in the mud and pinned Todd down. Harper did not have time for gentle medicine. The cold was setting in fast. Todd was losing blood. She reached into her trauma kit. She pulled out a thick dressing pad and a roll of heavy self-adhering bandage. She also pulled out 50 feet of military-grade paracord. "Listen to me, Todd," Harper said. She leaned close to his face. "I have to pull the leg straight. If I do not align the bone, it will sever the main artery. You will bleed to death in 5 minutes. This is going to hurt worse than the fall." Todd shook his head wildly. Tears mixed with the rain on his face. "No, please no." Harper did not hesitate. Empathy right now would kill him. She grabbed his heavy hiking boot with both hands. She braced her own boots against the slippery mud. She took a deep breath. She pulled. She pulled with explosive, brutal force. She dragged the foot straight toward her. The muscles in Todd's legs spasmed violently. The jagged white bone scraped sickeningly against muscle tissue and skin as it slipped back inside his leg. Todd screamed so loud his voice cracked. Then his eyes rolled back. His head slumped into the mud. He passed out from the overwhelming pain. "Good," Harper muttered. "That makes this easier." She worked with rapid, mechanical precision. She pressed the thick trauma dressing directly over the open wound to stop the bleeding. She wrapped the tight bandage around the calf. Then she turned to the environment. She grabbed 2 thick, straight pieces of dead oak wood from the forest floor. They were the thickness of her forearm. She placed one on the left side of his leg and one on the right. She took the green paracord and bound the wooden splints tightly to his leg. She tied rigid square knots above and below the knee and right above the ankle. The leg was completely immobilized. "Is he dead?" Mark asked. He was shivering violently. "He is unconscious," Harper said. She stood up and wiped the blood on her pants. But he cannot walk. We are half a mile from the ranger cabin. We have to carry him. For the next 2 hours, the mountain tested them. Harper and Mark carried Todd using a crude seat carry method. Their lungs burned in the freezing air. Their muscles screamed with lactic acid. They slipped in the mud. They stumbled over hidden roots in the dark. Sarah walked ahead with a single yellow glow stick, clearing the path. When they finally broke through the tree line, the shape of the small wooden ranger cabin appeared against the dark sky. It was completely dark. Harper kicked the wooden door open. The cabin was empty. The rangers had likely gone down to the valley for the weekend. The air inside was freezing, but it was dry. They dragged Todd inside and laid him gently on the wooden floor. "There is no heater," Sarah cried. She was wrapping her arms around herself. "We are going to freeze to death." Harper ignored her. She walked to the small stone fireplace in the corner. There was dry, chopped wood stacked next to it. She knelt down. She pulled a handful of dry birch bark from her pocket. She reached into her pouch and retrieved a thick ferrocerium rod and a steel striker. She scraped the steel down the rod hard. A shower of bright, burning sparks rained down onto the birch bark. She blew on it gently. A small flame caught instantly. She fed it small twigs, then larger branches. Within 3 minutes, a warm, roaring fire lit the inside of the cabin. "Take off your wet jackets," Harper ordered. "Sit by the fire. Keep him warm." Harper stood up. She walked back to the open wooden door. She stepped out onto the covered porch. She looked past the pine trees, out toward the west. From this high elevation, she should have a perfect view of the Puget Sound. She should be able to see the sprawling, glowing metropolis of Seattle. She should see the bright ribbons of the interstate highways and the flashing lights of the airport. She saw absolutely nothing. The valley below was a void. It was a massive, terrifying ocean of pure black. Not a single street lamp, not a single car headlight. The entire grid was dead. The cold realization finally washed completely over her. The military had drilled her on this scenario during her search and rescue training, an electromagnetic pulse. The cities would become immediate death traps. The concrete canyons would turn into slaughterhouses as millions of people fought over vanishing resources. Her father was down there. Elias was a brilliant man with numbers and supply chains, but he lived his entire life behind a desk. He relied on rules. He relied on order. He did not know how to start a fire in the rain. He did not know how to filter dirty water. He was trapped in a dead city filled with desperate, violent animals. Harper turned back toward the cabin. She looked at the 3 terrified hikers huddled around her fire. They were safe here. The cabin had chopped wood and a hand pump for well water outside. They could survive for a week if they stayed put. She reached down and picked up her heavy canvas pack. She strapped it tight to her chest and waist. "Where are you going?" Mark asked from the floor. He looked up at her in panic. "I have to go down the mountain," Harper said. She drew her heavy knife and checked the sharp edge in the firelight before sliding it back into the sheath. "Do not leave this cabin. Do not open the door for anyone." She stepped off the porch and out into the freezing rain. She walked quickly toward the main logging road that led down to the valley. She was leaving the safety of the wild to walk directly into the collapse of human civilization. She reached the edge of the wide gravel road. She stopped. Far below her, near the base of the mountain, she saw movement. It was not a car. It was a long line of flickering orange lights, moving steadily up the logging road toward her position. They were torches. Firelight. A massive, organized group of people was already marching out of the dead city, and they were heading straight for her mountain. Chapter 4. Static and Steel. Wyatt Gallagher sat perfectly still in the cold metal chair. His breathing was slow and measured. The basement smelled of damp concrete and hot dust. He reached forward with a wrinkled hand. He turned the heavy black dial on the primary radio receiver. The large speaker produced a loud and aggressive hiss. It was pure white noise. He adjusted the squelch knob to filter the sound. Nothing changed. The hiss remained constant and dead. Wyatt had built this room 10 years ago. The walls of the basement were completely lined with fine copper mesh. It was a perfect Faraday cage. It protected his vintage communications equipment from external electromagnetic interference. The radio on his heavy wooden desk operated on old glass vacuum tubes. It did not contain modern silicon microchips. It was completely immune to the massive pulse that had just murdered the modern world. Immunity did not mean salvation. A radio required someone on the other end to transmit a signal. He swept through the high-frequency bands. He checked the 2-meter local channels. He checked the dedicated federal emergency broadcast frequencies. He found absolutely nothing. The entire western seaboard of the United States was completely silent. Wyatt leaned back in his chair. He was 68 years old. He had spent his entire career as an electrical engineer for the Regional Power Authority. He knew exactly how the national grid was structured. It was a fragile web of high-voltage transformers and computer-automated relays. He had warned his supervisors for decades about the vulnerability of the system. They had called him a paranoid old man. They had ignored him. He looked at the glowing orange filaments inside the glass vacuum tubes of his radio. They were the only lights left in his world. He stood up slowly. His knees popped in the quiet room. He walked to the locked steel cabinet in the corner of the basement. He opened the heavy door. He reached past his emergency food supplies and grabbed his rifle. It was a Winchester lever-action .30-30. It was an old design, but it was perfectly reliable. He loaded 5 heavy brass cartridges into the side-loading gate. He grabbed a heavy canvas coat and walked up the wooden stairs toward the ground floor of his farmhouse. 3,000 feet above the dark landscape, Maddox Cade was fighting the wind. His hands gripped the heavy leather yoke of the Cessna 182. The small cabin vibrated violently in the turbulent storm air. The air-cooled flat-six engine roared with a steady and mechanical rhythm. Maddox was a deep cynic, but he trusted this specific machine with his life. The plane was built in 1974. It utilized basic carburetors. It had braided steel cables connected directly to the flight control surfaces. It did not rely on a single piece of computer software to stay in the sky. Maddox looked out the scratched plexiglass window. 10 minutes ago, he had watched the entire city of Seattle simply blink out of existence. The massive grid of city lights had vanished in a fraction of a second. His electronic tablet had cracked loudly and died on his knee. His modern aviation headset had produced a sharp squeal of feedback before going completely dead. He tapped the mechanical altimeter on the plastic dashboard. The white needle was steady. The heavy engine was feeding on gravity-fed aviation fuel. The spark plugs ran on engine-driven mechanical magnetos. The old plane did not care that the electrical grid was entirely gone. It only cared about basic physics. Maddox had a serious problem. The sun was gone. He was flying completely blind over the Cascade foothills. He had 20 gallons of fuel left in the wing tanks. He needed to put the plane on the ground immediately, or he would crash into the side of a mountain in the dark. He banked the Cessna hard to the right. He looked down for flat terrain. He strained his eyes against the gloom. He spotted the long and straight gray ribbon of State Route 18. It was completely dark. He saw a few scattered shapes of dead cars stalled on the asphalt, but there was a clean stretch of highway near a dark rural farmhouse. It was his only chance. Maddox pulled the throttle back. The engine noise dropped to a low growl. He grabbed the manual flap lever located between the front seats. He pulled it up hard. The mechanical flaps extended from the wings. The plane slowed rapidly. The wind screamed past the thin metal doors. He lined up the nose of the plane with the center of the highway. He ignored the freezing sweat running down his neck. The wet asphalt rushed up to meet him. The main landing gear slammed violently into the ground. The plane bounced 10 feet back into the air. Maddox cursed loudly. He pushed the yoke forward and forced the plane back down. The rubber tires screeched against the wet road. He stamped hard on the manual toe brakes. The aircraft swerved aggressively to the left. He kicked the right rudder pedal to keep it straight. The right wingtip barely missed the roof of a stalled pickup truck. The plane finally shuddered and rolled to a complete stop in the middle of the highway. Maddox exhaled a long breath. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. He reached forward and pulled the red mixture knob all the way out. The heavy engine choked and died. The metal propeller spun a few more times before stopping completely. Total silence enveloped the cabin. The only sound was the cold rain hitting the aluminum roof. Maddox unbuckled his seatbelt. He reached into the side pocket of his leather flight jacket. He pulled out a heavy-frame .35-7 Magnum revolver. He flipped the cylinder open, verified 6 hollow-point rounds were loaded, and snapped it shut. He pushed the cabin door open and stepped out onto the wet highway. The wind cut through his jacket immediately. He stood near the wing strut and looked around. The world was dark. "Step away from the aircraft," a rough voice called out from the darkness. Maddox spun around. He raised the heavy revolver. An older man was standing 20 yards away on the grassy shoulder of the road. He was holding a lever-action rifle. The barrel was pointed directly at Maddox. The man wore a heavy canvas coat and a dark wool cap. It was Wyatt. "Lower the gun," Wyatt said firmly. He kept the wooden stock of the rifle pressed tight against his shoulder. I am not going to shoot you unless you force me to. You first, Maddox yelled over the wind. He kept both hands on the grip of the revolver. I just survived a blind landing. I am not in the mood to get robbed by a farmer. I am not a farmer, Wyatt replied. He did not lower the rifle, and I do not want your plane. I heard the engine. Everything with a computer chip in a 1,000-mile radius is dead. You are flying a mechanical relic. Maddox narrowed his eyes. The old man sounded calm. He sounded rational. Maddox slowly lowered the barrel of the revolver toward the asphalt. Wyatt mirrored the movement and lowered his rifle. The whole grid is gone, Maddox said. He took a cautious step forward. My radios are fried. Seattle is totally black. It is an electromagnetic pulse, Wyatt said. He walked slowly onto the highway. I am a retired electrical engineer. I was monitoring the high-frequency radio bands from my basement. There is no signal coming from anywhere. The federal government is gone. The military is completely deaf. Maddox stared at the old man. The grim reality settled heavily over him. He looked back at his plane. It was suddenly the most valuable machine in the entire state. It was a vehicle that could cross the ruins of the country in hours instead of months. They both heard the sound of breaking branches at the exact same time. Wyatt turned his head sharply toward the dense tree line on the other side of the highway. 3 men stepped out of the heavy brush. They were soaking wet and covered in mud. They looked like hunters, but their eyes were wild and desperate. The man in the center racked the pump of a 12-gauge shotgun. The heavy metallic clack echoed loudly in the quiet night. The other 2 men raised bolt-action hunting rifles. Drop the weapons, the man with the shotgun yelled. He leveled the heavy barrel at Maddox. Both of you, put them on the ground right now. Wyatt brought his rifle up fast, but the 2 men with the hunting rifles already had him in their sights. He froze. Maddox tightened his grip on his revolver, doing the mental math. 3 long guns against 2 men caught in the open. They were dead if they fired. I said drop them, the leader shouted. He took 3 fast steps toward the airplane. He looked at the metal fuselage with pure greed. Toss the keys on the ground. Step away from the machine. It does not use keys like a car, Maddox lied through his teeth. His mind raced for an advantage. You need a specific sequence to start the magnetos. Shoot me, and you ruin the engine. Do not test me, the man growled. He pressed the stock of the shotgun to his shoulder. I will blow your leg off and make you tell me. 100 yards down the dark highway, Elias Vance pushed his stolen bicycle through the wet grass. His thigh muscles burned with a violent intensity. He had ridden 15 miles in 2 hours. He had bypassed the Block City Bridge by carrying the heavy bicycle over a dangerous railway catwalk. He was exhausted. He was cold. He was entirely focused on reaching his daughter. He heard the loud voices ahead. He stopped immediately. He let the bicycle fall gently into the tall grass. He dropped to one knee. Elias crawled forward through the wet weeds. He reached a rusted metal guardrail. He looked over the steel barrier. He saw the unbelievable shape of an intact airplane sitting in the middle of the dark highway. He saw the pilot holding a revolver. He saw an old man holding a rifle. More importantly, he saw the 3 armed men threatening them. Elias analyzed the tactical situation in seconds. The old man and the pilot were trapped. The 3 attackers had the superior angle and superior firepower. Elias did not know these people. The logical survival choice was to crawl backward, retrieve his bicycle, and disappear into the night. Then he looked at the airplane. It was a functional vehicle. It could bypass blocked highways, destroyed bridges, and violent mobs. It could cover the remaining 25 miles to the Cascade Mountains in 10 minutes. It was the absolute key to finding Harper. Elias reached down to his right hip. He drew the compact 9mm pistol from its holster. He checked the safety lever. He pushed it off. He rested his forearms on the wet steel guardrail to stabilize his aim. The metal was freezing against his skin. He aligned the glowing green night sights directly on the center of the man holding the shotgun. He took a slow, deep breath and held it in his lungs. Chapter 5. The First Alliance. Elias held his breath. His finger tightened on the trigger. He stopped. A direct firefight was a statistical failure. He held a compact pistol. The men on the highway held long guns. Even if he dropped the leader with a perfect shot, the other 2 would instantly turn their rifles on his position. He needed an asymmetric advantage. He lowered the weapon. He slid backward through the wet grass. He crawled parallel to the steel guardrail. 50 yards down the dark highway, A large white utility truck had crashed into the concrete center divider. The side panel read Cascade Pool Services. Elias stood up in a crouch. He moved quietly to the back of the heavy truck. The metal roll-up door was partially open. He smelled the sharp, burning odor of concentrated chlorine. He pulled his dead flashlight from his pocket and used the heavy aluminum casing to smash the padlock. He lifted the door. The back of the truck was filled with commercial chemical supplies. He found a 5-gallon plastic bucket of granular calcium hypochlorite. It was industrial pool shock. Next to it sat a cardboard box filled with standard automotive fluids, motor oil, antifreeze, and a yellow plastic bottle of commercial-grade brake fluid. Elias knew basic chemistry. It was a mandatory part of hazardous materials transport training. Mixing granular chlorine with the polyethylene glycol found in brake fluid created a violent exothermic reaction. It produced massive amounts of toxic white smoke and a sudden, explosive burst of heat. He grabbed the heavy plastic bucket. He poured half of the white powder onto the wet asphalt. He grabbed the yellow bottle of brake fluid. He unscrewed the cap. He crawled back toward the guardrail. He dragged the heavy bucket with his left hand. The men on the highway were shouting again. "I am losing my patience," the leader yelled. "Give me the gun or I start shooting." Elias positioned himself behind a thick concrete pillar. He looked at the robbers. They were focused entirely on the airplane. Elias poured the entire bottle of thick brake fluid directly into the bucket of chlorine. He did not wait. He grabbed the heavy bucket by the metal handle and threw it over the guardrail with all his strength. The plastic container crashed onto the highway 20 yards behind the 3 armed men. It rolled twice and stopped. 1 second passed, 2 seconds passed, then the chemicals reacted. A loud, violent hiss cut through the cold air. A brilliant flash of bright white fire erupted from the plastic bucket. It was instantly followed by a massive, towering cloud of dense chemical smoke. The smoke expanded rapidly across the wet asphalt. The sudden flash temporarily blinded anyone looking in that direction. The 3 robbers panicked. The loud noise and sudden fire broke their concentration. The leader spun around. He raised his 12-gauge shotgun toward the burning bucket. He thought they were being flanked by a larger group. Elias did not waste the opportunity. He rested his pistol on the cold guardrail. He aligned the glowing green night sights on the leader. He squeezed the trigger twice. The sharp cracks of the 9mm pistol rang out. The first round hit the leader in the right thigh. The heavy hollow-point bullet expanded on impact. The man screamed. His leg buckled instantly. The heavy shotgun fell from his hands and clattered onto the road. Maddox reacted with the pure instinct of a survivor. He saw the leader drop. He raised his .35-7 Magnum revolver and fired. The heavy gun roared like a small cannon. The massive muzzle flash illuminated the dark airplane. The heavy bullet struck the asphalt right at the feet of the second robber, showering his legs with sharp fragments of rock and hot lead. Wyatt did not freeze this time. He worked the lever action of his .30-30 rifle. The brass casing ejected cleanly. He fired a warning shot directly over the head of the third man. The sharp crack echoed loudly through the dark valley. The ambush was broken. The 3 men had lost their tactical advantage. They were caught in a deadly crossfire between the airplane and the unseen shooter behind the guardrail. The thick, toxic smoke from the burning chlorine was drifting toward them. They started coughing violently. "Get up," one of the men yelled. He grabbed the wounded leader by the collar of his wet jacket. They did not try to retrieve the dropped shotgun. They dragged their bleeding friend backward. They scrambled frantically over the highway median. They disappeared into the dark, heavy timber on the far side of the road. The highway went silent again. The only sound was the violent hissing of the chemical fire. Thick white smoke rolled low across the ground. Elias kept his pistol raised. He watched the tree line for 3 full minutes. He waited for return fire. Nothing happened. The robbers were gone. He stood up slowly. He kept his hands clear of his body. He stepped over the rusted guardrail. The loose gravel crunched loudly under his boots. Maddox spun around. He leveled the heavy revolver at Elias. Wyatt swung his rifle toward the new target. "Stop right there," Maddox ordered. His voice was hard and tight with adrenaline. "Drop the pistol, kick it away." "I just saved your life," Elias said calmly. He did not drop the weapon. He slowly lowered it so the barrel pointed down at the wet road. He held it carefully with only 2 fingers. "If I wanted to take your airplane, I would have shot you while you were talking to them." Wyatt stared at the middle-aged man in the wet jacket. He saw the cold, calculating look in Elias's eyes. Wyatt slowly lowered his rifle. Put the gun down, Maddox, Wyatt said. He rubbed his tired eyes. He is right. We were dead men. Maddox hesitated. He looked at the burning bucket of chemicals. He looked back at Elias. He slowly lowered the heavy hammer on his revolver and holstered it. Elias walked forward. He stopped 10 feet from the airplane. He looked at the old man, then at the pilot. They were an unlikely pair. My name is Elias Vance. I am a regional logistics director for the commercial supply chain. Maddox Cascade, the pilot said. He crossed his arms over his leather jacket. This is Wyatt. What was that explosion? Calcium hypochlorite and polyethylene glycol, Elias said. A basic exothermic chemical reaction. I found a pool supply truck parked down the road. You think fast, Wyatt said. He tightened his grip on his rifle. But you are out here alone. Everyone else is running south toward the military base. You are heading east. Why? My daughter is 40 miles east of here, Elias said. He looked at the dark silhouette of the Cascade Mountains. She was leading a wilderness group near the upper ridgeline. She has no idea what is happening in the cities. I need to get to her. Maddox let out a harsh, cynical laugh. He shook his head. Good luck. The roads are a massive parking lot. You cannot drive a car. You cannot ride a horse through this mess. You will never make it 40 miles. I have a bicycle, Elias said flatly. A bicycle, Maddox scoffed loudly. You will be dead by morning. People are already killing each other for winter coats. Elias looked directly into Maddox's eyes. He did not blink. I know the exact fuel reserves of every aviation depot in this state, Elias said quietly. Maddox stopped laughing. The heavy silence stretched between them. Aviation fuel, Elias continued. He stepped closer to the pilot. Your mechanical plane runs on 100 low-lead aviation gas. There are no working electronic pumps at the regional airports. When your wing tanks run dry, this airplane becomes a useless piece of aluminum. I know where the gravity-fed storage tanks are located. I know the warehouse distribution routes to bypass the blocked highways. I know the logistics blind spots. Maddox looked at the fuel gauges inside his dark cabin. He knew Elias was completely right. He had 20 gallons left. That was nothing in an apocalyptic wasteland. What is your offer? Maddox asked. His voice was all business now. You have a working vehicle and a radio, Elias said. He looked at Wyatt. I have the tactical maps in my head. We form an alliance. You help me extract my daughter from that mountain. In exchange, I guide you to a secure fuel depot and a rural food distribution center. We resupply and we disappear into the high country before the cities completely devour themselves. Wyatt looked at Maddox. The old engineer nodded slowly. They needed a plan. Surviving the night was not enough. They needed a long-term strategy. I have a farmhouse 2 miles from here, Wyatt said. It has a deep water well and a mechanical hand pump. We have cover, but we need a runway to get this plane back in the air. We clear the highway, Elias said. We use the manual winch on my pool truck to drag the stalled cars off the asphalt. It will take 5 hours. We fly out at first light. Maddox looked at the heavy rain clouds. The storm was finally breaking. He looked at the determined man standing in front of him. We are going to need a name, Maddox muttered. He rubbed the cold metal of his revolver. If we are going to fight our way through this mess, we are a unit now. We are the Vanguard, Elias said quietly. We clear the path. They stood together on the dark highway, 3 strangers bound by absolute necessity. The pact was sealed in the freezing rain. They turned their attention to the crashed vehicles blocking the road. Elias retrieved his heavy canvas bag and his bicycle. He walked toward the abandoned pool supply truck. He climbed into the driver's seat and located the heavy steel winch cable on the front bumper. He released the manual locking pin. He dragged the heavy steel hook toward the nearest stalled sedan. They worked in total silence, muscle and bone against dead steel. Maddox steered the dead cars while Elias and Wyatt used the hand winch to pull them into the muddy ditch. It was brutal, exhausting labor. Their hands bled, their muscles cramped. But slowly, inch by painful inch, they carved a clear path down the center of the interstate. The eastern sky began to turn a dark, bruised purple. Dawn was approaching. It would be the first sunrise of the Dark Age. Maddox climbed back into the cockpit of the Cessna. He primed the engine. He engaged the mechanical starter. The heavy engine sputtered, coughed loudly, and roared to life. The spinning metal propeller blew wet leaves and debris across the cleared highway. Elias strapped his bicycle securely to the right wing strut, using his heavy paracord. He climbed into the narrow back seat. He rested his wet boots against his canvas survival bag. Wyatt climbed into the passenger seat holding his rifle. "Hold on!" Maddox yelled over the deafening noise of the engine. He pushed the throttle forward. The plane surged down the cleared stretch of highway. The rubber tires hammered against the rough asphalt. The speed increased rapidly. 50 miles per hour, 60, 70. The wings caught the cold, dense air. The small aircraft lifted smoothly off the ground. Elias looked out the scratched plexiglass window. The ground fell away quickly. They climbed above the tree line. As the plane banked east toward the mountains, Elias finally saw the full scale of the nightmare. Seattle was burning. Dozens of massive, uncontrolled fires raged across the urban grid. Thick columns of black smoke rose miles into the dawn sky. There were no fire trucks, there was no water pressure. The city was simply cooking itself alive. But that was not what made Elias's blood run completely cold. He looked down at the major interstate highway leading directly toward the Cascade foothills. The road was not empty. It was choked with a massive, crawling black river. It was an endless, terrifying swarm of desperate people. Thousands of them. They were marching out of the burning city like a plague of locusts. They were pushing shopping carts, carrying heavy bags, and holding burning torches. And they were heading exactly toward the mountain where his daughter was waiting. Chapter 6. The Iron Shadow. Harper Vance pressed her back against the rough bark of a massive Douglas fir. She controlled her breathing. She inhaled through her nose and exhaled slowly through her mouth. The freezing rain soaked through her waterproof jacket. She ignored the cold. She watched the logging road 30 yards below her position. The river of torches was moving closer. It was a chaotic mob. Hundreds of desperate people were marching up the steep gravel incline. They were fleeing the burning ruins of Seattle. Harper heard their voices. They sounded like a panicked herd of cattle. They were shouting over each other. They were dragging heavy plastic coolers and carrying stolen grocery bags. They had absolutely no survival discipline. They would freeze to death or kill each other before they reached the snow line. She tightened her grip on the heavy carbon steel knife. She needed to move higher up the ridge. She needed to circle back to the ranger cabin and secure her clients. Then she heard the noise. It was a low mechanical drone. It cut through the sound of the wind and the shouting mob. Harper looked up at the gray sky. The heavy storm clouds were breaking apart. A small airplane broke through the mist. It was flying incredibly low. The engine sputtered aggressively. It sounded like it was starving for fuel. Harper watched the aircraft bank sharply toward a wide, clear-cut logging area, half a mile to the north. She knew that clearing. It was a flat expanse of packed dirt and massive tree stumps. It was barely long enough for an emergency landing. She sheathed her knife. She turned and began to sprint through the dense underbrush toward the clearing. Inside the cockpit of the Cessna, Maddox fought the heavy yoke. His forearms burned with lactic acid. The wind shear coming off the mountain peaks was violently pushing the small plane toward the tree line. He tapped the glass fuel gauge with a thick finger. The white needle rested firmly on the empty peg. The air-cooled flat-six engine was running on vapor. "I see a flat strip," Elias said from the back seat. He pointed over Wyatt's shoulder. 2 o'clock. An old logging yard. It looks clear of heavy timber. Maddox saw the brown strip of dirt. It was dangerously short. It was surrounded by 70-foot pine trees. It was a suicide run in normal conditions. "Brace yourselves," Maddox ordered. He did not have enough altitude to circle. He pulled the throttle completely back. The engine noise dropped to a quiet idle. He grabbed the manual flap lever and yanked it to the full extension. The aircraft dropped like a heavy stone. The tops of the pine trees rushed past the windows. The wings shuddered violently. Maddox kicked the left rudder pedal to align the nose with the muddy dirt strip. The ground came up terrifyingly fast. The main gear slammed into the deep mud. The impact threw Elias hard against his seatbelt. The heavy tires dug deeply into the soft earth. Thick brown mud sprayed up over the plexiglass windshield. Maddox stood entirely on the manual toe brakes. The tail of the plane whipped sideways. The metal frame groaned under the extreme stress. They slid sideways for 200 feet. The right wing tip clipped a massive wooden stump. The plane spun violently to a halt. Silence flooded the cabin. The engine was dead. Maddox released his grip on the yoke. His knuckles were pure white. He let out a long breath. "We are on the ground. Everyone out." Now, Elias kicked the thin metal door open. He jumped down into the ankle-deep mud. He drew his compact 9mm pistol immediately. He scanned the dense tree line. Wyatt climbed out awkwardly, holding his heavy lever action rifle. Maddox stepped onto the wing and looked at the dented aluminum tip. The plane was intact, but it was not flying again without a serious repair. A sharp crack of a breaking branch echoed from the woods to their left. Elias pivoted instantly. He raised the pistol. He centered the glowing green night sights on the dark shadows between the trees. His finger rested flat against the trigger guard. A figure stepped out from behind a large fern. Elias froze. His heart slammed against his ribs. He lowered the weapon slowly. Harper stood at the edge of the clearing. Her face was smeared with dark dirt and dried blood from Todd's injury. Her clothes were soaked. She looked feral. She looked extremely dangerous. Then her eyes locked onto the middle-aged man standing in the mud. "Dad," Harper said quietly. Elias holstered the pistol. He did not run. He walked forward with heavy steps. Harper closed the distance. They met in the center of the muddy logging yard. Elias wrapped his arms around his daughter. He pulled her tight against his wet chest. He buried his face in her damp hair. He did not speak. There were no words required. The crushing weight of the dead city lifted slightly from his shoulders. He had done the impossible. He had found her. Harper pulled back after a long moment. She looked at his rugged face. She looked at the heavy canvas survival bag on his back and the dirt on his clothes. "You made it out of Seattle," she stated. It was a fact, not a question. "We made it out," Elias said. He turned and gestured to the two men standing near the airplane. "This is Maddox Cade. He is the pilot. That is Wyatt Gallagher. They saved my life. I saved theirs. We are a team now." Harper nodded at the two strangers. She noticed their weapons. She noticed their disciplined posture. They were not panicking tourists. They were survivors. "There is a massive crowd of people moving up the logging road behind me," Harper said. Her voice was pure business. "Hundreds of them. They have torches. We cannot stay here in the open." "We need cover," Elias said, "and we need heat. Where is your hiking group?" "I left them in a Stone Ranger cabin a mile up the ridge," Harper answered. "It has a solid oak door and a heavy fireplace. It is highly defensible." "Lead the way," Maddox said. He grabbed his heavy canvas duffel bag from the back of the plane. They hiked through the darkening forest in a tight tactical formation. Harper took the point position. She navigated the treacherous terrain with practiced ease. Elias walked behind her, watching her flanks. Wyatt and Maddox covered the rear. They moved silently. They listened to the distant, chaotic roar of the mob migrating up the mountain. They reached the stone cabin just as the final light faded from the sky. Harper knocked on the heavy wood in a specific rhythmic pattern. Mark pulled the heavy metal bolt back and opened the door. The three tech workers were huddled near the roaring fire. They looked terrified when the three armed men stepped inside. "Do not panic," Harper commanded the hikers. "These men are with me." Elias walked straight to the fireplace. He held his freezing hands out toward the bright orange flames. He felt the intense heat sinking into his skin. He looked around the small stone room. It was primitive. It was a complete return to the 18th century. They had shelter, they had fire, they had a small arsenal of firearms. Wyatt set his heavy canvas bag on a wooden table. He unzipped the main compartment. He pulled out a large rectangular box built from black impact-resistant plastic. "What is that?" Maddox asked. He walked over to the table and wiped rain from his face. "It is a mechanical shortwave receiver," Wyatt said. He flipped two metal latches and opened the lid. The inside contained a heavy coil of copper wire and a large rotary dial. "I built it myself. It does not use external batteries. It relies on a heavy internal kinetic spring." Wyatt pulled a small metal crank handle from a slot in the case. He attached it to the side of the box. He began to turn the handle rapidly. The loud, mechanical grinding noise filled the small cabin. He cranked it for 2 solid minutes. He stopped and flipped a heavy metal toggle switch. A harsh blast of white static exploded from the small black speaker. "The military possesses hardened communication bunkers," Wyatt explained. He slowly turned the large frequency tuning dial. They use massive underground Faraday cages. If the federal government survived the pulse, they will broadcast on the emergency shortwave bands. They will give us rally points. They will tell us where the relief centers are located. Elias stepped away from the fire. He watched the old engineer work the radio. Wyatt turned the dial past the civilian emergency frequencies. Static. He moved to the aviation distress bands. Static. He tuned into the primary military alert frequency. The speaker hissed aggressively. "Nothing," Maddox said. His voice was grim. "Nobody is coming to save us. Wait, Wyatt said sharply. He stopped his hand. He carefully nudged the heavy dial a millimeter to the left. The white noise broke. A voice cut through the static. It was perfectly clear. It was not an automated recording. It was a live transmission. The group gathered tightly around the wooden table. They held their breath. It was a male voice. It was incredibly calm. It lacked any trace of panic. It was deep, resonant, and chillingly authoritative. This message is broadcast on all open frequencies, the voice stated slowly. The sound echoed off the stone walls of the cabin. The federal government of the United States has fallen. The military chain of command is broken. The grid is permanently destroyed. There is no rescue coming from the east. Wyatt stared at the radio. His hands began to shake slightly. My name is Silas Thorne, the voice continued. I am the director of the Iron Syndicate. As of this hour, all remaining FEMA supply depots, clean water reservoirs, and agricultural zones in the Pacific Northwest are under our direct military protection. We are the only remaining authority. The voice paused. The crackle of static filled the silence. Then Silas Thorne delivered his final condition. Any independent groups attempting to hoard food or weapons will be classified as hostile scavengers. You will be eliminated. Submit to our regional outposts immediately. Surrender your supplies to our officers. Surrender and live. Resist, and you will burn with the cities. The transmission clicked off. The radio returned to a dead, empty hiss. Wyatt reached out and turned the volume knob to 0. Total silence reclaimed the cabin. The 3 hikers sitting by the fire were crying softly. Maddox looked at the wooden floor. The reality of their new world was far worse than a simple blackout. A ruthless warlord had already seized the ultimate power. Elias Vance did not look at the radio. He looked into the heart of the roaring fireplace. The orange flames danced across his hardened face. He thought about the men he had shot on the highway. He thought about the logistics of surviving a hostile occupation. He thought about his daughter, standing right beside him. He turned his head slowly. He looked at Wyatt. He looked at Maddox. Finally, his eyes locked onto Harper. We will not surrender, Elias said.